All right, I'm Daniel Taylor. I have spent about 40 years teaching as a lit professor, a writing professor. Quit a little bit early, about 6 years ago, to spend more time writing. Have been interested in story and the concept of story, initially perhaps consciously as an academic and teaching stories and teaching literature, but at some point realized, actually from writing a book, I wrote a book called Letters to My Children, which was just a collection of letters, and it was not intended to ever be a book. It was first just letters I wrote to my kids when they were quite small, on the premise that there was no guarantee I was going to be around forever. And I was going to do the fatherly thing and pass on my values and way of seeing the world. And as I kept writing these letters over a period of maybe 5 years, three to 5 years, I found out that I was always telling stories. You know, if I had a value, I had a story that went with the value, and it's something I should have been aware of as a lit professor anyway, but I started to realize the extent to which stories are fundamental, and they're not entertainment, they're not just something that a few people do. Everybody is born into stories and raised in stories and processes the world through stories. And stories are the great vehicle for values and for history and for our understanding of ourselves. We preserve anything that's really important to us, we preserve in a story. So that got me thinking about how stories work in our lives, not just how stories work in literature. And so it actually led to another book called Tell Me a Story, which explored the way that stories work in our lives. And so I've been writing and thinking and talking about stories, and of course, like everybody else, telling stories for decades now. And so since stopping teaching, I have fallen solo that I'm now writing novels. And I've just, gone right to the chase, I guess you could say. And so stories is still a central part of how I think about life. Moving from the earlier kind of writing I did to fiction felt pretty much the same. I mean, you're still using, in the nonfiction, you're still using scenes and characters and settings and trying to use descriptive detail. I would say the main difference for me in doing fiction is there's no remembered event that acts as sort of a guide or a limit. I mean, if you're doing memoir, we all know that we create fictional things even as we try to remember, but memoir, has a remembered event that kind of demarks limits for where you work. But fiction, you can do absolutely anything, and that's both a freedom, but it's also kind of a terror, you could say. I mean, it's like, well, anything can happen here. I can kill this character, I can make them happy, I can make them sad, So it's more of a, in some ways, writing fiction is more of a challenge because of the lack of limits. Yeah, Jon Mote, poor fellow. He's the first person narrator of this book, and he's got problems. He hears voices, he's it's never said in the book, but he's sort of borderline multiple personality. He's in the middle of a psychic disintegration, which his sister is trying to rescue him from. He started out, I actually started this novel 25 years ago. He started out as a kind of a tribute character to a great friend of mine who died when we were both in our 20s. And his name had the melodious name of John Dingledine. And so I created John, and I had a kind of a general sense of him. But the more, as I wrote and rewrote this novel, John got more and more troubled, the character. So he got further away from my great friend. I like him because he tries really hard. I think we often don't realize how much people with psychological issues, how heroically they struggle to do everyday life. People with depression, for instance. Getting out of bed, combing your hair, and getting dressed and even starting their day requires so much more psychic courage than for the rest of us. And so Jon puts up a fight, against his disintegration, always losing, really. He's sort of a serial failure in life. Fails at marriage, fails at academics, thinks he's failing to be a good brother to his sister, fails in career. So, but he's always hopeful or, doggedly trying to do better. And one of the things about him, and I think maybe it's a consequence of his problems, is that because he is so troubled himself, he goes easy on other people. He's not judgmental. He wants to do the right thing, he gives other people the space to be whatever they are as well. So I think he's a trouble, but I think a likable narrator. Characters, of course, come from everywhere in one's experience, and I think some writers, and I, of course, have done the same, have created characters whole cloth out of the imagination. And sometimes a lot of times it's based on need. You need a certain kind of character in a certain situation, so you invent them. I think many characters, and often the most important characters in a novel, are at least in part directly from the author's experience, from the writer's experience. And that's certainly the case in this novel. As I say, Jon started out as my friend, and maybe I think that was helpful, because my friend had kind of a quiet, accepting personality to him, which I think stayed in Jon even as I added all the problems that Jon has. And the sister is directly a woman from a time in my life with my wife when we ran a group home for, I guess cognitively challenged is the right word now, adults. And so she's really quite directly preserved. But I don't feel any need to be accurate. I don't think writers feel any need to be accurate with a character who's based on someone from life. They're kind of a starting point, and the character becomes whatever, in a sense, whatever the character needs to become. And I think there's a lot of times the story shapes the character as it's unfolding as much as the character pre-exists before the story. And so there's a lot of writing, of course, is discovery, not just putting down what you already know or think. And so fiction writers discover their stories and their characters as they write them. And sometimes characters surprise you. A lot of writers have talked about that. Faulkner said, I just run behind my characters writing down what they're saying as fast as I can. And of course that's somewhat disingenuous, but there's something to that too. You create a world and it starts going in motion, and you as the writer, you have control over it, but sometimes it's just sort of theoretic control because the characters start doing what they want to do. Judy is a wonderful woman. She's I'm thinking she's about 40 in the story. And she, as I said, is based on a woman who has had Down syndrome. She has died. That was part of this group home that we ran when we were in our 20s, my wife and I. And I would say she's the moral center of the novel. She's kind of got a singular focus. Her answer for every problem is Jesus, but it's not a cant, it's not propaganda. It's just how she sees the world. She was first raised by the Baptists. Their parents died. She then moved to the group home raised by nuns, and so she just has this God consciousness. So Judy is sort of the representative of dogged pursuing love toward her brother, and she's the older sister to her brother, and she's sort of protected him from early on, because Jon's had his problems from early on, and Judy has always looked out for him. So it's sort of Humpty Dumpty. Jon's Humpty Dumpty, and Judy's trying to hold him together or put him back together. And I think a lot of the sort of emotional weight of the novel, or any kind of plot tension in the novel, has to do with the degree to which Judy is able to rescue her brother. Well, I was living with them for 3 years, 24/7. I mean, we ran a group home, and we got Wednesday nights and every other weekend off. Otherwise, it was, and I was teaching at the time, so I would go away in the daytime. So, I mean, in many ways, the novel is a tribute to people like this, and kind of it's not in a rhetorical, persuasive way, but a testimony to the rich lives that they can live. And there's a sequel to this, which is even more so, because he's going to move back in with these people, and there will be six of these adults with these disabilities. And so I found them fascinating as human beings, and Judy is their representative in this particular novel. And so I wanted to, in a sense, honor them, but also explore how they relate to the world, because I think in many ways we are all disabled, right? So this idea that they're some special category because of the nature of their own disabilities separate from us, I think, is false. It's just they're wounded in this way, we're wounded in other ways. So the things that we can learn from them, and learn from not them as a class, but individuals like Judy, should create an affinity rather than some sense of separation. So all of that is interesting to me. Well, the title "Death for the Deconstruction" comes for the Deconstructionist. Clearly an echo of a more famous book. The first thing to say is my wife hates the title. She says people don't know what a deconstructionist is. But, in my way of thinking, well, then why they'll buy the book to find out what a deconstructionist is. The deconstruction is was a literary theory that had its, like all theories and ideologies, had its day in the 70s and 80s and started waning in the 90s, the last century. And the victim, you might say, in this novel, which is not really a crime novel or a detection novel, it's sort of participating in that genre, is a rock star deconstructionist. And the narrator went to graduate school, and this guy was his mentor. He eventually left graduate school partly because the deconstructionist wasn't happy with his dissertation. And then 10 years later, finds that he's dead, and his wife hires the narrator to look into it. Deconstruction, it's a literary example of postmodernism. And a basic tenet of postmodernism is that you do not discover reality, you create reality. And there's parts of postmodernism I'm attracted to because it emphasizes story and how stories shape us, et cetera. But basically, postmodernism and deconstruction tends toward a kind of relativism where it offers Jon, the narrator, this possibility that maybe he could create a new reality for himself. And he feels the need to do that. And so he's taken initially by Pratt's very pyrotechnic, brilliant analysis of everything, and this idea that life can just be play just the play between ideas and words and all this kind of stuff. And he tries that on, and it, of course, doesn't cure what ails him, and so he has to, he abandons that. So deconstruction is both significant for the novel, but it's not significant. It's not central to the novel. It's just another thing that Jon attempts to try to keep himself together. I do think that the core of the novel is this relationship between Jon and his sister, but it's in some ways it's a novel of ideas. It sort of explores a lot of contemporary ways of thinking and seeing the world, and so I thought it was a handy and a slightly humorous way to structure the novel. Yeah, well, like I said, when you start with a blank computer screen, or in my case, probably I started years ago with a blank piece of paper, you can do anything. And one of the first things you have to decide is who's telling the story. Where's it coming from? Is it an omniscient narrator? I mean, somebody's telling the story. And you have to talk about what tense you're telling it in and what point of view. And so I ended up with, and did a number of rewrites to get here, a unreliable first-person narrator. I think maybe unreliable, I'm attracted to unreliable first-person narrators. I've written other short fiction, and they seem to pop up in my fiction. Maybe because I think of myself as an unreliable first-person narrator of my own life. There are all kinds of pros and cons with any narrative choice. One of the advantages of a first-person narrator is we have a human tendency to identify with or be sympathetic to a person telling us their story, unless there's something that's really off-putting, right from the beginning. But it's a natural human tendency, if I start to tell you my story, that you're going to listen with some kind of identification or sympathy to it. So unlike an omniscient, godlike narrator who, knows everything, that first-person voice kind of gets inside of us. The disadvantage of a first-person narrator, possibly, and especially one with as many problems as Jon has, is they can wear you out, over a whole novel. And Jon just keeps having one problem after another and kind of whines about them. And so it's sort of like, so you have to be careful about that. You also have to, you've limited yourself with not about how the story can reveal things. How would this narrator know that? So you have to be consistent and careful about. So there's a lot of things to think about when you choose who's going to tell the story. The present tense is unusual. And I actually wrote an early draft in past tense, and then I changed it to present tense. Most stories are told in past tense. And I thought I had to tell this story in present tense because Jon is at risk. These voices he's hearing are very kind of muted at the beginning, but they start getting stronger as the novel goes on. And there's a real possibility that they're going to take over, become the dominant personality, or even worse, a threat to him and a threat to Judy. And so I thought if I tell this in past tense, you know the narrator has survived it and is looking back at it. If you tell it in present tense, it, I think, heightens the sense of tension that, And of course, it's all because we're suspending disbelief. It's not because, there's any real danger here, but that's what story does to us. It brings us into the story. So the first person and the present tense were both sort of strategic choices. A central thesis to how I think about the world is that we are shaped by our stories. And I don't think there is a huge distinction between a literary story and a quote-unquote real-life story in terms of influence. In fact, in some ways, the books we read and the art we see and the plays we go to might even be, because they're distilled and crafted, might even be more powerful in shaping us than what happens at the 7-Eleven store, you know. So I am a former lit professor, so I'm awash with stories. And I had an interesting childhood, moving all around and, like everybody else, filled with stories. And so, yeah, they've shaped me. And if I try to consciously identify, and if I was totally shameless and maybe slightly inebriated, I would say this novel is the love child of Dostoevsky and Flannery O'Connor. It's got Dostoevsky's underground man, this guy who's just tormented, first-person tormented narrator. John's last name is Mote, which is a very conscious salute to Flannery O'Connor's Hayes, Motes, and Wise Blood. And I think there's some of that, I don't want to call it Gothic because that's a word that's been misused, I think, with O'Connor, but there's sort of that over-the-top, sometimes quasi-surreal quality to both Dostoevsky and O'Connor. So I would, I wouldn't be so foolish as to put myself as a direct ancestor, but those are people who shaped me. If I think of modern writers who maybe have a sort of kindred spirits, I would see things like people like Walker Percy or Frederick Buechner, maybe Andre Dubus, the senior, people like that. I would be very happy to be thought to be in the same universe as those kind of writers. I think anybody who grapples with, I'm attracted to the Russians, for instance. Anybody who grapples with the big questions and has some kind of ambition and is happy with failing magnificently is attractive to me. I mean, my favorite single book is Moby Dick. I suppose I identify with Melville. Melville, the guy who wrestled in his own life with faith and doubt and put it in his stories and asked the cosmic questions, And this novel certainly doesn't have anything like that ambition, but it's a little slice, it's a character trying to figure out life and trying to keep himself together and trying to figure out God. I'm just going to think out loud. I don't know if I'm going to believe what I'm saying here myself, but there is a way in which writers and just people work out their life. I'll talk about writers, work out their life through their writing and their own questions. So I've written, books that are manifestations of my own struggles or thoughts about faith and doubt. Wrote a book called The Myth of Certainty my very first book 20, 30 years ago, and more recently a book called The Skeptical Believer, Telling Stories to Your Inner Atheist. Well, in that book I have a character, I do think I have an inner atheist, so which I don't want anybody to be frightened that I'm demon-possessed, but it's a part of my mind that when the faith part of me says, I affirm this, the atheist says, well, what about that? And he's kind of a snarky guy. And so in writing that book, The Skeptical Believer, I was kind of trying, and in that first one 30 years ago, Myth of Certainty, I was trying to, by writing about it, I was exploring the issue for myself. And that was an example of writing as discovery, not writing as, I know what I think about it, I'll just put it on paper. So Jon Mote, I have friends who've read the novel and who smile at me when they bring up Jon Mote because they think they see me in Jon Mote. And I would not have necessarily thought that there was much of me in Jon Mote, but on reflection, that way of talking, the way I put it is Jon Mote has my mental furniture. He's read the same books I've read, and he's probably a Dodger fan like I was when I was a kid and all this kind of stuff. So he's watched the same TV programs. So when he makes a reference to Gilligan's Island or whatever, that's because it came out of my brain. And so I do think I'm certainly not haunted by voices or don't have many of the issues that he has, but there is a certain extent to which a part of me is Jon Mote. The same way that Prufrock is partly T.S. Eliot, but he's not T.S. Eliot, right? So I think the novel is, at least, in some more unconscious than conscious way, a working out again of what do I see as the relationship between love and intelligence and intellect and, risk and what's worth risking for and how much certainty do you need in life and all of that, which I sort of explored in nonfiction, which I actually explored extensively in nonfiction. And I suppose I'm now exploring some of that in fiction as well. Yeah, I would love to write fiction that takes religion seriously, which I think not very much contemporary literature does. If it appears at all, it's usually in a cartoonish kind of way. Jon is running, both Jon and Judy, his sister, were raised hardcore Baptists, but their parents die when they're about 12. Well, they're different ages, but early adolescence. And Judy goes to live with the nuns. Judy is unapologetically religious. We like to say these days, people like to say, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, which for me is sort of like saying I'm political but I don't vote. Judy votes, and it's God and it's Jesus in a very simple kind of way, simplistic really. I mean, she's just way too simple, but powerful because it just is so clear to her. While Jon is running from God, but he keeps running into his sister who keeps telling him he needs a little more Jesus. So the fact that she's simplistic, is sort of off-putting, and it isn't effective in a sense as Christian propaganda. But you learn to love Judy, and so you start to think she has maybe a wisdom. She's in touch with something that other people aren't in touch with. But I allow Jon to run. I don't bring him back and convert him on the last few pages or anything. He's still running at the end. But he has an intense experience that he doesn't know what to make of at the end that has a setting, a religious setting somewhat, and it doesn't lead him to the altar, but it shakes him up. So I like characters who can think about God, be troubled by God, run from God, at least engage the concept and the possibilities, even if wherever they land. I think that's interesting. I think human beings, their natural impulse is towards religion, and it has to be suppressed to get it out of us. And there's a lot of forces in the contemporary world that do try to suppress it, but it's just there. And so to exclude it, I think, is to diminish the human experience. So I'm interested, and there is Jon is on a kind of a quest and a pilgrimage, which is going to continue in future books, and I don't know where he's going to end up. But these issues arise. It's in some ways it's the best time of my life. You fantasize, if you start writing books, I didn't start writing books till I was in my mid-30s, and I'm glad. I think I would have said even more stupid things if I had started earlier than that. But you always fantasize, well, if I didn't have this teaching job, I'd really be cranking them out. And my Nobel Prize would not be far away. And so I was, 62 when I got the opportunity to leave a little early. And it took me 30 seconds or so to decide to quit teaching. And I literally told myself, you maybe have 10 years. You shouldn't count on any more than 10 years. You maybe have 10 seconds, but till your early 70s, and you might just run out of energy and stuff. So I've been writing hard for the 6 years I've been not teaching. And I also decided, I've written about a dozen books, and I kind of am done trying to tell people how to think or how to live or, what to think about God or anything else. And there's something very freeing about I'm just going to tell pure stories, you could say, in terms of fiction. Of course, the people who have read this novel say, "Oh, you're still telling people what to think," and I think that's true. I think this idea of art for art's sake is a little bit of a charade. Artists have all kinds of things they think about the world, and they're trying to persuade you of, even if they won't admit it to themselves. So it's very liberating to me, and it's very enjoyable to write in this particular genre now. And I would guess that most of what I write for the rest of my writing life will be fiction. My main strategy is just to get up in the morning and think that one of the main things I'm going to do today is write. And it doesn't have so much to do with the time or the form or anything like that. So, Joyce Carol Oates, who I actually interviewed once, said that she is amazingly prolific, famously prolific, says, "I have started to write when my soul felt as thin as a playing card." And she says, somehow, in the process of writing, the inspiration comes. And I think that's very helpful and very true. It's butt in chair that leads to production. It's time in front of the screen or in front of the pad of paper. And do not wait for inspiration. Inspiration is way overrated. The writing will produce the inspiration. It isn't the inspiration then leads to the writing. So I try to think this is the main thing I'm at least doing this week, and hopefully on this particular day, is to try to just add somewhat to what I did yesterday. Garrison Keillor has this little 1 minute long spot called Writer's Almanac on public radio, and he reads a poem or something, talks about a particular writer for a few seconds, and he always ends with, "Be well, do good work." Well, that's my motto at this point in my life. Stay alive, be well, and just try to do good work. I'm using a lot of story in nonfiction, but I'm also, talking abstractly. I use need to wait for that.
I think that might be you.
Oh my gosh. Let me see. I'm going to have to answer this. Hello? Hello? Oh my gosh. It's a woman trying to sell me a newspaper.